Jesus mentions the word Samaritan, all of a sudden the listeners would understand who the Samaritan was. So, like with these parables, there are elements, there are pictures that the listener, the hearer, would immediately know. And these listeners would certainly say, aha, that's who he is, that's who that person is. So the words that Jesus uses and the people he identifies would have been very much up close and personal to the listeners.
Welcome, everyone, to the 40th podcast of Renew Your Mind. Today, we have with us Pastor Paul Gruenberg, our senior pastor, and we have Reverend John Naile. He's our pastor of visitation and our past senior pastor, past twice. And then we have myself, Dana Hall, as a moderator. And just a note, it may sound a little different today because we are recording a little differently. We have a Zoom going on because we have Pastor Paul off-site. And then myself and Reverend John are in the room with Dan Hawkins, our awesome producer. So we just have a lot going on. So we're trying to navigate through this a little bit differently. So we hope it sounds okay. To wrap it up, or not to wrap it up, but to start it off, we are speaking about parables. And our previous podcast was about parables. And simplistically, it is an earthly story about a heavenly truth. And I'll be honest, I'm not sure that when I've heard parables, I'm not sure that that I heard or understood that a very easy to understand story was about a heavenly truth. So I'm glad that both the pastors have already explained that. So we're going to delve into a particular parable. We are in Luke 10, and we're going to start with verse 25. And it's the parable of the Good Samaritan. And I'll let Pastor Paul kind of start us off with that.
Thanks, Dana. One of the aspects of this parable and the other one we're going to touch on next podcast, I was talking with John earlier about what parables we should cover, and John honed in on these two particular parables. The Samaritan is probably one of the best known parables regarding people using the Good Samaritan, or, hey, are you a Good Samaritan? I mean, it just kind of is a well-known, moniker that people get called. Hey, he was a Good Samaritan. And so that's why we chose this. And then the other one would be the prodigal son, again, which we'll cover next week. But one of the aspects of the parables we need to understand is that Jesus didn't always just share a story to share a story. He shared a story to make a point. And in this particular parable, there was an expert in the law who stood up to test Jesus. They were trying to get Jesus to say something wrong, or something that would be blasphemous, something that would cause him to get into trouble. And he said, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus oftentimes will answer a question with a question. And he says, what is written in the law? How do you read it? And then the expert in the law just says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind. Love your neighbor as yourself. And these were very familiar passages from the Old Testament in a place called the Shema, the Old Testament from the Torah. And Jesus simply says, you have answered correctly. Do this and you will live. And then, of course, the expert wants to justify himself. So he says, Jesus, and who is my neighbor? John, who is my neighbor?
Oh, you're asking me. I thought you were going to read the scripture.
I'm working through it. So okay. In the reply, Jesus uses a man, robbers, a priest, a Levite, and a Samaritan. And the man is going down to Jerusalem from Jericho. And it's a a 20, 21 mile stretch, and it's got lots of turns and stuff. And there are sections of that you just never want to travel alone because it's known as a place where robbers hang out. And yet a man goes walking down foolishly by himself and is robbed. He is beaten and he is stripped. Everything is taken away within an inch of his life. And then three guys come by. Jesus talks about these three guys. The first one's a priest, the second one's a Levite, and the third one's a Samaritan. And it says about the priest, happened to be going down the same road. When he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too a Levite, when he came to the place, saw him and passed by on the other side. But the Samaritan, well, let's handle the priest and the Levite, John.
Well, as we said in the last podcast, the listeners would clearly see in their mind who these two people are. And they would also know who the teacher of the law is. I imagine the listeners, when Jesus is telling this would be primarily male, so they would understand right away what was happening, and they certainly would know, as you alluded to, the passage from the Shema and all of that. And so when he mentions these people, the listeners would know exactly who the priest was. Now, for the priest and the Levite, one of the real scary things for them is they could not touch
That's right.
this beaten body. I'm sure if they were close enough, they maybe could observe that he was still breathing. But certainly if he was dead, you don't touch a dead body, because then all of a sudden factors come in that you have to be cleansed and all that meant. So they completely stay away from him. And then when Jesus mentions the word Samaritan, all of a sudden the listeners would understand who the Samaritan was. So like with these parables, there are elements, there are pictures that the listener, the hearer, would immediately know. They would have seen the man go out and sow the seed. They knew that. They would know about a sheep being lost. And they certainly would know who the priest was or who the Levite was. And because there was this pecking order, and these listeners would certainly say, aha, that's who he is. That's who that person is. So the words that Jesus uses and the people he identifies would have been very much up close and personal to the listeners.
So a priest would have been one of the potentially a temple priest who would go into the temple and take care of either the altar of incense or the lamp that burns, refilling the oil. So they would have been pretty high up on the Hollywood A-list as people that are really close to God in this sense, not making movies, of course, but close to God. And then the Levites would be of the same lineage of the priests, but they would be in the surrounding towns and communities. They would still be respected, but they would not necessarily be going into the temple to care for the very ornate or the very important things of God. So for both of these guys to walk by, like John said, if they touch a dead body, you're unclean for 7 days. That means you can't do the things that you're supposed to do. And you'd have to separate yourself. Here's a COVID term, right? You'd have to separate yourself from the rest of your family, your society. And during those 7 days, wait until you are clean again.
But I do have a question. I do have a question about that is, so help us understand if the priest or the Levite would have chosen to tended to this person that was so badly hurt or maybe possibly dead, did they still know that they should help that person? And even though they had to follow the rules of being unclean and they, have to follow all the rules to become clean again, um, I mean, they should have still helped that person, correct?
Well, this is one of the things that Jesus did and said that challenged the authorities
Mm-hmm.
because he saw need over and against and above the tenets of the law.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, the priest would be following what he knew, what he thought he should be doing, the same thing with the Levite. But Jesus is saying, isn't this Samaritan your neighbor? And we'll get into who or what a
Sure.
Samaritan is. But no, it would have been a tough call for this person to make.
Okay.
And that was what caused the authorities to look with a jaded vision
Mm-hmm.
at Jesus because he's doing things. Jesus is accused of taking some corn or wheat out of the field. And they attack Jesus at that. How come you're doing that? You're not supposed to be doing that on the Sabbath.
Mm-hmm.
And Jesus responds, well, didn't David do that on the Sabbath? And of course, they revered King David to the nth degree. So
Mm-hmm.
he comes back at him time and time again, but it was people, not necessarily the law,
Mm-hmm.
but for them, the law was supreme.
Mm-hmm. So Jesus was trying to also teach the priests and the Levite, and they needed to have
Right.
open ears
Right.
to his words.
And this person that was having the dialogue with Jesus, Jesus wants to make sure, okay, I'll show you who your
Mm-hmm.
neighbor is, and we'll do it by telling this story, this
Okay.
parable.
Okay, thanks.
So we move into the Samaritan, and the Samaritans he was the third person to come by, and he was the guy who went over and he checked on this guy, and he did some things that were way, way over and above anything that a Samaritan may have done, because the Samaritans were at odds with the Jews. Well, the Samaritans were half Jews. They were half blood. They had intermarried with Assyrian people back in the day, 700 years before. And so their blood was no longer purely Jewish blood. That would be like saying, okay, so I'm German. Did I have ancestors who were a part of the Nazis? Yes. And so I might be tainted by some people because of my heritage. Well, the Samaritans, I mean, this is 700 years later, and the Jews dislike, even hate the Samaritans because of they not obeying God's law and intermarrying with other cultures.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a lot of animosity. And as John said, when the name Samaritan got mentioned, that would prick the ears of the teacher of the law, the expert of the law. And this Samaritan did some amazing things. John, why don't you take that?
Well, to add to what you said about the Samaritan, if you were going from point A to point B and the shortest route was through Samaria, you did not do that. You walked the long way around. I mean, it was that kind of animosity, that kind of barrierness. But what the Samaritan does is he tends to the wounds of this person who has been beaten. And then he puts him on his burro, his donkey, and takes him to an inn or a hostel or someplace. And this is one of those examples of a parable with a backside that you don't see as Jesus is telling it, but it is there. He says to the innkeeper, okay, I want you to take care of this man. Here's some money. I'm going to come back, and if there's anything more, I will pay it. And what I see in that is the innkeeper takes the role of the church, that the church has a responsibility to take care of people. Now, it's easy well, who's a Samaritan? Well, I can remember years ago, and I'm embarrassed, I can't tell you how long ago it was, but when the AIDS epidemic blossomed, that very much would have been the same thing. Would you go to a hospital? Because one of the tragedies of an AIDS victim was the loneliness that they experienced. And there were many wonderful Christians who reached out and still went to hospitals. And the AIDS victim didn't need a lot, but to a person to come in and maybe hold this person's hand, have a word of prayer, just come and visit them was a healing episode because they were shunned. And it was this, to me, it was the same kind of attitude towards a Samaritan. And this Samaritan man comes along and helps what we assume is a Jewish man who's been beat up and left by the side of the road to die. And Paul is exactly right. I mean, there are places, I mean, you know, the bandits hid out and hid from, and, you know, travelers kind of thing. So people just did not go anyplace basically by themselves because they never knew what was going to happen. But what he did was over and above, and that's becomes the point of that story.
Mhm.
Okay.
And when it says 2 denarii, I mean, it doesn't sound like much money he gave to the innkeeper to care for this guy. But there are some that say that that amount of money was between 24 and 48 days of room and board. So you're talking about upwards of 3 weeks to 6 weeks worth of pay uh, to help somebody else out, as far as the room and board goes. And we don't always do that. We're talking, not only does he help him physically, but then he takes from his wallet and helps him that way financially too.
Mm-hmm.
And so, there's so much here, and we would really need another half an hour or so to really talk through a lot of this stuff.
And see,
Regarding.
that's the beauty of the parables,
Mhm.
because people have done this for 2,000 years, endeavoring to plumb the depths of what this parable or many of the parables actually say.
So he tells the parable, and then the expert in the law replies, because Jesus asks who had mercy on this guy that was beaten up, and the expert of the law says, the one who had mercy on him. And then Jesus simply says, go and do likewise. And so there's no escaping what Jesus wants this expert in the law to do. And as John said earlier, Jesus is challenging living by every dot and tittle of the law versus living in relationship with God and with those who are our neighbors.
Do we know who the expert in the law is?
Somebody high up in the food chain,
Mhm.
the religious food chain. It doesn't have a specific name attached to it.
Okay. Could it be a priest?
Well, it probably wasn't a priest. It could have been someone related to the local synagogue,
Mm-hmm.
because I know in Jesus telling the story, he doesn't say the rabbi, the teacher. He says the priest.
Mm-hmm.
He says the Levite. So in the ascendancy, these two men were higher up, and the teacher of the law may have been third on the list or
Okay.
fourth on the list. But his role would have been, if he was attached to a particular synagogue, his role would have been, okay, I'm going to interpret the law, the rabbi, and I'll maybe teach Sabbath school or something.
Mm-hmm. I just find it interesting that I guess it would be he is open-minded.
Well, remember, he was maybe even trying to trap Jesus. So he may have been open-minded, but he may
But
have been
maybe
one
not.
of those guys just trying to trap Jesus into saying something
Okay.
blasphemous or wrong.
Okay. Oh, you're right. There's so many different. I mean, you could keep talking about this, like you said, for another half an hour. So, okay. Any other thoughts? Parting thoughts before we end this podcast?
I think we wanted people to look at Luke 15 for next week. Is that
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
exactly right. Yep. So next podcast, we'll be looking at Luke 15.
And please read it. Please read it.
Short chapter.
That's your homework assignment. All right. With that, we'll end this podcast. And just a reminder, we are located at the First United Methodist Church, 215 South Center in Gaylord, Michigan. And we have 2 services, one at 9 a.m., one a contemporary at 10:45 a.m. And we also show those via Facebook and YouTube. So if you could join us in any which way, we welcome you to do that. Thanks, everyone.